Good morning, everyone. This is work? Yeah, okay. Hi, it gives me great pleasure both to welcome you all and at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning in the middle of our session. It's an impressive show of your commitment during the for the workshop to come to turn up so early. Yeah. So welcome to all of you, and of course, particular welcome to Dr. Radhika Coomaraswamy, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome her. I've known Radhika since both of us were much younger than we are now. I think my first research project as an undergraduate was working for Radhika several decades ago. Let me introduce Radhika Coomaraswamy, although I know many of you already know of her work. Dr. Coomaraswamy is renowned for her international leadership on human rights, feminism, and the protection of children rendered vulnerable in contexts of armed conflict. She served as a UN Undersecretary General and a Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, and earlier as a UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. In both of these capacities, she served as an international advocate for women and children, reporting to the Security Council, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, and the international community at large on the vulnerabilities of women and children, and the legal and policies steps that the international community should undertake to address those vulnerabilities and provide justice and redress. Most recently, she served on the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, and as many of you know, the mission submitted its report and its findings after a 15-month examination last September, and we're still awaiting sort of the implementation of those recommendations. A graduate of both of Yale, of Columbia, and Harvard, and a recipient of numerous honorary degrees from universities all over the world, Dr. Coomaraswamy is also that rare species of sort of scholar policymakers. She lectures at New College in Oxford and is a regular visitor to NYU as a global professor of law. I've spoken sort of briefly, I don't want to take too much time, about Professor Coomaraswamy's international qualifications, but on a more personal note, I also wanted to highlight Dr. Coomaraswamy's work in Sri Lanka, where she serves on the Constitutional Council, has served in the past as chair of the Human Rights Commission, and in a range of other important national roles. In particular, however, I wanted to highlight Dr. Kumari's significance to Sri Lankan civil society and her contributions to bodies such as the International Center for Ethnic Studies that she led for many years. Institutions that have long promoted and sustained local scholarship and a tradition of global South-based academic production, both theoretical and empirical. This work has inspired and supported a vibrant intellectual community in Colombo and the country as a whole for many decades on internationally relevant research regarding constitutionalism, feminisms, interethnic justice and civil rights, and the history and politics of caste and class. One of the governing mandates that have driven IGLP for the past 10 years has been this commitment to supporting scholars based in the Global South. So I want to draw attention to Dr. Coomaraswamy's own long-standing commitment and contribution to precisely this endeavor. Indeed, Radhika Coomaraswamy is both a scholar and a policy leader with far-reaching impact in academic communities as well as communities addressing international law and policy. I can think of no other person who better embodies the convergence of the scholar and policy streams represented in our meeting this week, and no better person to address our assembly this morning. So welcome, Radhika. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasuki, for that very generous introduction, and I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. I served, and I'm going to talk about the United Nations in the field. I served the United Nations thrice. First as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and this was in the late 1990s and then the early 2000s. It was the first time they had created that post, and it's linked to the Human Rights Council. I served as the special representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict from 2006 to 2014. That was an Undersecretary General post. and it was a full-time position. And so that was also in my mandate. And finally, today, even though we submitted our report in September, I am still on the fact-finding mission on Myanmar for the Human Rights Council with regard to the Rohingya issue. What I'm going to begin today is something really that has nothing to do with policy or law. I'm going to read to you, now that I've retired semi from the UN, I have been working on my diaries. And I want to just read to you, perhaps to give you an experiential sense of what it was like to work in these fields for the UN, the story that's not told in the UN reports. And since my work took me to conflict areas and other areas, I thought it would be interesting for you. And then from that, we can draw the debates and the discussions that have flown. I would like it to be interactive, so once I've finished, I'll also speak from Myanmar. After finish, I would like to have your reactions, and then we'll sum up with the discussion on the debates that are there. And let me begin. This is a trafficking diary from Nepal. This is in the early 2000s. It's about Nepal and India. The hospice was clean but crowded. These were trafficking victims. I'm sorry, I want to actually begin with the South Africa. We went into South Africa to look at the issue of rape because the figures were very high. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, we went to the issue in South Africa. South Africa is the rape capital of the world, screamed the movie star next to me. I flinched. They just cannot control their impulses. The Secretary General had asked me to accompany him to Hollywood with many other UN officials to raise awareness about what the UN does, especially in the field. I was now on a panel moderated by Larry King about rape in Africa, following some particular egregious case. I now was trapped. I had to express moral outrage, but I could not completely let down my African brothers. So I began by saying how the rapes that happened were terrible, but that we must understand, and then I lost them. They wanted blood and thunder. I could read their minds. Weak, ineffective, wimpy, incoherent, I froze. Their view of the UN was confirmed. Moral outrage is an important commodity in the field I work in. It is what moves people to act, to help, to pass laws, to train police officers, to give money, and to shame those who enjoy the privilege of impunity. In the early days, I expressed it without reservation. There was so little awareness about domestic violence or rape, and we did so much to be done. The louder we shouted, the better. More action, more money, more results. But in a media-savvy world, we may now be having an overdose of moral outrage. At some point in the 2000s, the UN began to involve leading celebrities, actors and actresses in their activities. And of course, they did yeoman's work, raising awareness that few others would be able to do. But soon there was a feeling that this would become the main thrust, and billions were spent in this partnership. Activists, especially in the South, began to turn off. Moral outrage was becoming a PR show. Also, the quality of the moral outrage began to change. Moral outrage not rooted in the human rights tradition, but floating by itself, can be sheer anger with strange incarnations. When Wonder Woman was made an ambassador of UN Women, I was aghast. Metal clothes and thigh-high boots were outside my realm of what the UN should be doing. But the young people I knew loved it. Perhaps it's a generational thing. The colleagues of my generation never thought of militarizing our struggle. We only wanted to strengthen the criminal justice system. Nonviolence was a key concept. But now, in a world where institutions were failing, women too were producing heroes who are fighting for good outside the system. But sometimes it is moral outrage without understanding social structures. When I landed in Johannesburg to inquire into the so-called rape epidemic they were having in South Africa in the 1990s, it was just after apartheid, and the government was still trying to consolidate power. The head of the UN was there to greet me, but the program officer with my program and details was missing. We waited about half an hour and headed to the UN office. The poor officer had called to say that on the way to the airport, he had been robbed of everything, including his clothes and his briefcase. When he turned up at the office, he seemed completely traumatized. But no one suggested he take a rest. There were not enough people. As a result, I had the most chaotic program, but I did not complain. In South Africa, your experience of rape and rape prosecution greatly depended on where you lived. In Pretoria, which is predominantly white, we were shown a police station with a state-of-the-art rape center. As soon as a victim comes in, she's taken to a comfortable room with warm faux leather couches and piped-in music. She is constantly accompanied by a policewoman. A rape support group is called in, and they take her with a state-of-the-art medical kit to the legal medical center, where she is examined and the test result delivered within hours. After that, for the next few months, the support group works with the police in preparing her case and gives the victim legal and psychological counseling. Not much needed for me here, I thought, as I cuddled in one of the couches, when suddenly through the door, I saw an African head staring at me. I moved one chair over and looked to see a jail cell so full of inmates that one was literally standing on the hip of the other. Who are they? I asked. Oh, people arrested on various charges. He looked again. It's a little crowded. No faux leather couches for them. On the other side of town in Alexandria, an African township, life was very different. There were gangs of boys going around raping girls for fun. They had complete impunity because the police rarely patrolled, and if they did so in huge tanks that looked like they had come out of Star Wars. It was so dangerous for them. We met one girl who was raped. She went to report it to the police station, and then she was raped again coming out of the police station. Nothing had happened in her case. She cursed herself for going to the police station in the first place and risking the second rape. Since apartheid was over, there was a belief among everyone that things would change. The police would be drawn from the community, and what we saw in Pretoria would be repeated here in Alexandria. They were so full of idealism and hope. They reassured us that this would be the case, and a lot has been done. Still, many decades after apartheid, rape statistics remain very high. In South Africa, I had another sideshow, besides a program officer who was subject to forced nudity and looked like he could never recover. While on a visit to Alexandria Township, my foot was bitten by an insect. It immediately bloated my foot, and I could not stand, let alone walk. The driver and assistants headed toward Pretoria Hospital, but when we got there, I was refused entry, since this was a white-only hospital, and they insisted that I should go to the People's Hospital, the hospital for black and brown people. The driver had a fit and called the head of the UN, who came rushing down, and with the sheer weight of his authority, got me admitted. I was the only non-white person in the whole hospital. It turned out this was not a simple insect bite, and that I would have to spend a few days in hospital with my leg raised and tied to a sling in front of me. Someone even talked of amputation, but I just went into denial. My assistant brought me my clothes, and I pulled out nightgowns over that a talented friend of mine had lovingly sewn for me. Still, there was a problem. The program which the traumatized assistant made up as we went along could not be stopped, and UN money could not be wasted. So with the permission of the hospital, people began visiting my bedside for their interviews, including the head of police, prosecutors, NGOs. Picture it, nightgown, leg in the air, in a sling, speaking to these people and taking notes. This is also the UN in the field. All of my guests were very amused, and they kept me occupied. In the midst of one of these interviews, two cousins of mine who lived in Botswana and whom I had not seen in years turned up at my bedside. Someone had told my brother and my mother that my leg may be amputated, so they sent these cousins to find out what was going on. They were relieved that I was all right, and I spoke to them in between interviews until they had to catch their flight back. So that's an experience of looking at rape cases in South America. Now let me talk to you about child soldiers. Moy was only 13 years old. He and his best friend were playing in the backyard of his house in Gulu, Uganda. Suddenly, the Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony, swept into the village. At gunpoint, he and his friends were asked to act as porters and carry the loot from the village and follow the LRA to their hideout. His friend slipped and fell and spilled his loot and was promptly shot in the head by a drunken commander. They were all taken to the hideout and were immediately given training to raid villages, kill, rape, and murder people. The stories he told are too gruesome to repeat. Kony was supposedly fighting for the rights of the Acholi people, but he had become a murderer and a child stealer. For some years, children marched hours from their villages into city shelters run by NGOs to prevent being recruited. Kony is still around. His mighty army has been broken into multiple ragtag units who scour the thick jungles of the Central African Republic as the countries of Africa and the world unite against him. After years of fighting, Moy ran away and came to the UNICEF shelter. For a 15-year-old, his shoulders were broad and muscular and his muscles firm. I was slightly frightened by the wildness in his eyes. As he looked at me, he looked like a man's soldier. He told me his story in fits and starts, and not very coherently. Then his face saddened. He told me that UNICEF had said that his father would come to see him, but he had not come. His whole body changed. He slumped. My father must be afraid. He became a child now and started to weep. I put my arms around him and he drew closer, resting his head on my shoulder. UNICEF reassured him that after a few weeks of getting him accustomed to civilian life, they will take him to his family. He was not convinced. Homecoming is not always joyful. It can be very stressful, especially when you know your child has killed and looted other people, abducted and now hated. Moy will have a difficult future once he leaves the confines of his protective UNICEF shell. Emmanuel Jar walked into my room and unannounced. Hey, madam, I hear you're helping children. I was a child soldier in South Sudan. I want to help. I'm a rap singer. I stared at him with his rasta hair and mischievous smile. My UN imagination was reaching its limitation. My staff came to the rescue. The Security Council was being very difficult, as it always is, about a particular resolution, and there was a discussion to see how we can move it forward. I was a little skeptical. Anyway, shaking the UN up with the reality of children was one of my special delights. Okay, Emmanuel can say a few words about the experience he went through. The meeting was convened at the technical level at the UN, a reluctant council not wanting to push the boundaries. I suddenly stiffened. Emmanuel was not going to speak. He was going to sing a rap song at that. I was not aware whether the protocol would permit it. Well, he was wonderful. His song ended when he pronounced loudly, "I'm here because someone cared. I am here because someone dared." It may have put some energy into member states. The next day, the resolution was passed. The next time I met Emmanuel was at the International Criminal Court on the final day of the Lubanga trial. We sat on either side of Angelina Jolie, and I was to explain the legal niceties to her. The most intellectual of all the child soldiers I've met was Ishmael Bear. Having graduated from the United Nations School in Oberlin, he wrote a book about his life as a child soldier in Sierra Leone. He admitted to all the terrible acts of violence that Charles Taylor's proxies made him do as a soldier. The famous stories of the chopping of hands and legs were done by child soldiers high on a mix of drugs and alcohol that was administered to them. Perhaps the most telling part of the story was their reaction when UNICEF rescued them. The rebel leaders were role models, and the children considered themselves to be soldiers. They were furious. When they were taken to a UNICEF shelter in turquoise UNICEF t-shirts, they just rioted. They ripped the whole place apart. Gradually, they came to terms with their new life. A young nurse had a profound influence on Ishmael, a UNICEF nurse, as did school. Finally, an American teacher and storyteller found him and was impressed by his intellect. She adopted him and brought him to New York, where he got scholarships, received psychotherapy, and is now studying for a PhD. In actuality, Ishmael is very shy and a gentleman who loves to talk ideas. Grace, though, was like my daughter. Born to an upper-middle-class family in Gulu, Uganda, she went to an elite Catholic convent. The LRA raided the convent and ran off with senior class members, including Grace. The Italian nuns ran after them, and the Mother Superior fell at Coney's feet and begged him to let them go. He gave her back half and took the other half. Grace was in Coney's bunch. She suffered the worst indignities that a woman could suffer, mainly in southern Sudan. She managed to escape when a Ugandan army patrol was passing. Things were calmer now in Gulu. She went back to school, though now with a Mother Superior, and graduated with honors. Seem to have lost the next page. Let me just say that she graduated with honors, and then she came to the United States to do her further degree, and she wanted also to help the Office on Children and Armed Conflict. And so we had her tell her story to the Security Council, because we wanted to make sexual violence an issue of peace and security. And she did. And something happened in the Security Council that I think has happened about twice or thrice, because it's prohibited. The council spontaneously and all broke into applause, which is, as you know, because of the weight of her and the resolution that we wanted passed. We can discuss in about 10 minutes. I will move to the levels of discussing what comes out of all this and the UN's role in assisting this. Let me just now talk about Afghanistan, a wholly different place. My first night in Kabul was not auspicious. The UN had put me in a leading hotel in the center of Kabul for comfort, and the Taliban, as a sign of welcome, decided to have a firefight on the side roads of the street. My security radio was flashing every second. I assured them that I come from Sri Lanka and I'm used to the anticipation of rifle fire and bombs. The firefight faded. Many died, but not me. I just went down and had breakfast at the hotel when a large contingent of UN security arrived, expecting to find me under the bed. They were relieved that I was not going to freak out and had decided to go with the flow. It was an important day. We were going to meet General Petraeus. He rarely meets anyone from the UN, but he had agreed to meet me. So you went to Yale. I was there at Princeton during the same time. Now I found the reason I was being met. The Ivy League has given me more access to decision makers in the US than anything else. Petraeus was wiry and with a mercurial mind. He was not at ease, but tried his best to be warm. None of them were fans of the UN human rights organs. He first wanted to discuss football. And then, of course, since I didn't know much about football, we moved in. Then we went on to business. We presented to him the checklist that the ICRC felt was necessary for conducting aerial bombardment, and we wanted to ensure that US security forces would follow the checklist. Petraeus was an ideas man and not interested in checklists. We became agitated when he brushed the paper aside. He basically argued that they were not practical. His blue eyes widened. We're fighting a war. Instead, he gave us a lecture on nation building, which is basically a large multi-sectoral effort to develop the nation while securing it. You said the UN must play its part. Brilliant in theory, but one conversation with a young Afghan boy would destroy the theory into pieces. Rational over planned macro politics would not work here, where all politics was really local. The earlier general, General McChrystal, who also met me because he had an Ivy League connection, was more focused and read our checklist in detail. He was a tall, extremely fit man who was full of energy. He filled the room, but he was concerned about the protection of civilians. He did go on to introduce some of the elements of our checklist into US operations, and civilian casualties did go down drastically during his tenure. Finally, he was destroyed by a reporter for bantering conversation. Even with us, he bantered especially about the UN, more to put us at ease than to be politically incorrect. At moments during these meetings and sitting outside offices in US Army headquarters, I watched these American soldiers. Many of them seemed so young, with pink cheeks and hardly any facial hair. And yet they all walked with an exaggerated swagger. I did not know whether this kind of swagger is intrinsic to the armies everywhere, or whether it is a subtle display of power. I was not an Afghan, but I found it offensive. It had master slave written all over it. What do you tell them? Don't walk with a swagger, you are offending people? I let it be because I noticed that the Afghan soldiers they were training also had developed a swagger. A young boy at a military camp was moving his back in provocative manners, trying to get the swagger right. The straight-back days of the old military was gone. But have we lost something? It is very hard to have a dialogue with a man who walks with a swagger. On the way to the airport, we got down at an unregistered internally displaced camp where refugees from Kandahar had gathered. As usual, I was taken to see the children, the women, and also a group of youth who looked so angry like they wanted to spit on all of us. We remained calm. The usual hello, how are you seemed to be awkward and out of place, so I thought I would talk to them one by one. Suddenly we were surrounded by very large men wearing the turban of the Pathan community. They were not invited. My bodyguard literally hugged me. Where are you from? They asked. I am from the UN. What country are you from? Sri Lanka, I said. They visibly relaxed and actually smiled. One of them spoke at length and asked why the UN always visits women and children and never has any programs for men. Whenever he applies for a job, they will not take him because he looks like the Taliban. He insisted that the UN should have programs for boys and men. I admitted to him that this was a dilemma. He then asked me to come and see how they were living. This was now an unofficial tour, and none of the staffers or security were happy. But how could one refuse? So he took me around. This was an unregistered camp, not run by UNHCR, but by the government. I was aghast. People were living in dark, pitch-black pits with absolutely no sunlight, surrounded by rubbish heaps. The whole place stank of a lack of sanitation. What do you say to people like this? What power do you have except to say, I will report it? And how hollow does that sound? My facial expression must have mollified him. He moved forward and touched the top of my kurta with his right hand. My bodyguard was about to swipe his hand away. He made a motion of calm. He said, in Afghanistan, when the king or warlord comes, this is the gesture we make to plead with him to make something happen. I'm pleading with her to help us. So desperate that he touched a woman, usually forbidden. I looked down. We will try, I said. On the way back, UNHCR repeatedly assured me that they will take over the management of the camp and make it live up to international standards. It took a little time, but I was told they finally did it. Now I'm going to skip all this. I didn't realize it takes so much time, and move to something completely different, which is to read you excerpts from the report on Myanmar, which was published just in September. And let me just first read from the methodology. Well, I'll just tell you what. The mission amassed a vast amount of primary information. It conducted 875 interviews. Now, this is about the Rohingya expulsion, with victims and eyewitnesses, both targeted and randomly selected. It obtained satellite imagery and authenticated a range of documents, photographs, and videos. It checked this information against secondary information assessed as credible and reliable, including organizations' raw data or notes, expert interviews, submissions, and open source material. Specialized advice was sought on sexual and gender-based violence, child psychology, military affairs, and forensics. Only verified and corroborated information was relied upon. To collect information, the mission members traveled to Bangladesh, India, Malaysia, Thailand, and United Kingdom. We did not travel to Myanmar, but we did conduct interviews with people within Myanmar on FaceTime and Skype. The Secretariat undertook numerous additional field-based missions between 2017 and 2018. We had a 20-member staff, and many of them went and lived in these areas. The mission also held over 250 consultations with other stakeholders, including intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, researchers, and diplomats, in person and remotely. It received written submissions, including through a public call. So I just want you to know that the UN, about 20 years ago, there'd be 3 people going around asking interviews. Now, when investigations are conducted, it's done very thoroughly. There is a booklet out. There is, in our case, because we had this alliance of the Europeans and Organization of Islamic Countries working together, we received a large amount of funding, so we had a large staff, and the material was taken. So it's not just based on the fact-finding missions discussions. Then let me just read the legal findings. Well, I don't want to read the actual, you all have read the news and you know what actually took place. The clearance operations by the Myanmar government that basically resulted in a great deal of human rights violations. They occurred when there were the ASA, which is the rebel movement armed with knives and shotguns and slingshots, attacked police stations. Reprisal came in terms of this massive cut down, and you've seen that on television. But let me just read you something that is the finding, the controversial finding, and that is the finding of possible genocide. The critical element of the crime is genocidal intent. The mission assessed its body of information in light of the jurisprudence of international tribunals regarding the reasonable inference of such intent. The crimes in Rakhine State and the manner in which they were perpetrated are similar in nature, gravity, and scope to those that have allowed genocidal intent to be established in other contexts. Factors pointing at such intent include the broader oppressive context and hate rhetoric, specific utterances of commanders and direct perpetrators, exclusionary policies including to alter demographic composition, the level of organization indicating a plan for destruction, and the extreme scale and brutality of the violence. Having given careful consideration to other possible infringers regarding intent, the mission considers that these can be discounted as unreasonable. The mission concluded, given these considerations on the inference of genocidal intent, that there is a sufficient information to warrant the investigation and prosecution of senior officials in the Tatmadaw chain of command, so that a competent court can determine their liability for genocide in relation to the situation in the Rakhine. The mission has drawn up a new non-exhaustive list of alleged perpetrators of crimes under international law, indicating priority subjects for investigation and prosecution. The list of the names of alleged direct perpetrators, but focuses on those exercising effective control over them. It's rare that UN reports mention lists, but we actually named 6 generals. Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Vice Senior General So Win, of course, mainly the Commander-in-Chief, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Vice Senior General So Wing, Commander Bureau of Special Operations, Lieutenant General Ong Kau Zhao, Commander Western Regional Military Command, Major General Mang Mang So, Commander 33rd Light Infantry Division, Brigadier General Ong Ong, Commander 99th Light Infantry Division, Brigadier General Tan U. So this decision to name by name was taken after a lot of consideration, mainly because we felt that the evidence was very clear and that these people should be, it would be a charge sheet to them from what we actually collected. So that is Myanmar, the nature of fact-finding missions that take place. So now let me just focus a little on the kind of issues that, to some extent, the debates, I'll call them debates, that come out of human rights UN work. First, I think the recognition that the United Nations is really a complex and overwhelming institution. And what is portrayed, especially in the public eye, is mainly the Security Council, which is known more for its failures. But there are some unmentioned and successes, such as the World Food Program. It is unlikely that the world will suffer the kinds of famines it has suffered in the past. The UNHCR, as you know, like you saw their intervention with this girl at the Bangkok airport. These are quieter institutions. They do their work, set up refugee camps. They don't, as a policy, speak on human rights unless it's really dire. Then, of course, you have the Human Rights Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. But if you take the UN as a whole, UNDP, UNICEF, and all the UN organizations with over 10,000 employees in New York alone, the UN is actually involved in practically every aspect of your life. Actually, there is, believe it or not, International Toilet Day, which pushed by President Modi, because he feels one of the big issues in developing countries is sanitation. And he may actually be right. That might be really crucial. But so one has to wonder now, this huge structure, the whole issue of autonomy of individuals and groups, when the UN, and this relates to the fact that UN is often as a template. Now this is, to me, interesting. As I go through the laws of my country, from the Constitution downwards, many of them are based on UN model legislation, so that the Fundamental Rights chapter of Sri Lanka is basically the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, with a few changes to make it more difficult for people to bring cases, but it's a template. And in many areas of the law, whether it's trafficking, whether it's that I have seen in national countries, the UN is the template. So you have this really very present United Nations, which you may not see, but it is there. Which then, of course, raises the whole issue of universal values, which the UN embodies, and local knowledge and local values. And I, of course, believe that things only really change if both are in sync. I don't think things change very much if it is only universal, international institutions. And I also don't think in really big, grave situations that if it's only a local fight, it works, especially if the what is against you is a very powerful, overwhelming force. So that is my theory, but we can discuss it. I'm trying to stop so that we can have. Then it raises the whole issue of double standards, as you know, US, China, and Russia, India. In the political arms of the UN are the ones that can give punitive action. And of course, there's double standards. How do humanitarians negotiate that double standard? And their approach is, of course, case by case. You know, is it better not to do anything because there are double standards and we're going to wait till the world changes, or do you work case by case and see if you can get justice for the individuals before you? And that's that is the even if it means that you would have the support of the US or the European Union. Then the whole issue of sovereignty. Now there is this approach to say that sovereignty is a positive, progressive act against the world order. But coming from Sri Lanka, I can say that it's more a cover for dictatorship. But you must realize that the history of another thing that I want to mention is the history of human rights in in US academia is drawn from the history of US human rights institutions, which is Human Rights Watch, things like that. But the history of human rights at the UN is a different story. It began with apartheid. It went on to disappearances in Latin America. Those were the issues that raised human rights before, not Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe issues only came in the late 80s. Then women and children issues were also brought up, as well as International Criminal Court after the Bosnia crisis. If you go through the UN's human rights agenda, it's always in response to a crisis. It didn't just appear out of the blue. So the International Criminal Court is absolutely a response to Bosnia and Rwanda. And if you read the text of the statute, is related to the crimes that took place in those countries. So let me just say that sovereignty over all this historical development of human rights, I find difficult. And sovereignty itself is used often for nationalism and progressive, non-progressive ideas. So let me just say that in the good things, there are a lot of bad things the UN, it's ineffective, it's double standards, it's political. The good thing is, while the political side of the UN continues to do its work, that the OHCHR and other human rights organizations, purely for the things we hate them for, which is that they are bureaucracy, they are meticulous keeper of records and archives on every human rights violation, including those in the US and China. It's just that the states decide not to act on them. And now, for example, we have been given a 1-year extension to get our archives ready to be kept in a special place in the UN in case any court wants it, in case any legislator wants it. And I think no one can hide now gross violations with the technologies we have, the testimonies we have, and the kind of things that through FaceTime and WhatsApp and Skype and satellite imagery, you can't hide huge grave violations anymore. So let me just end by saying that as you can see from the diaries, this is a very complex area, especially in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and you see horrible manifestations. I didn't read you my section on Iraq, where you really see terrible manifestations. But I think UN intervention is a good idea if it comes out of a general, united Security Council. But if it comes purely as, and that's the other thing I did not mention, which is one of the crucial issues in this, is the relationship of the US with the UN. Human rights and all did develop very fast when we had the Carter administration and the Clinton administration, but in the Bush administration and others, we had a terrific, horrible relationship with the United States, and as a result, some of the policies did go. The preeminent role the US plays and the problems that produces for the United Nations. So let me just leave you there. Since we started late, and we have a few more minutes for questions. Thank you. And just questions. Yes, go ahead.
In fact, I'm doing my PhD now on the role of multilateral development banks in promoting sustainable public procurement. Just to give you a big background, why am I so passionate about this research work? Unlike you, who is doing this work as an outsider, I am doing that work as a victim. I fought corruption in my country and then faced so many death threats. I left my country because I was being cartel went for me because I'm trying to protect the public bidding for infrastructure projects in schools. Why? Because I believe that education is very important in providing good future in my country. Because I came from a slum area and tried to follow my dream without the help of my government to become a lawyer. So I know the importance of education. I work with prisoners. I know the importance of human rights. I know the importance of women, gender, all of your stories. But I am in the ground. So it's like every time I saw a person from international organization, it's like, please. So my question is, why did you not go to Myanmar? Most probably another Afghanistan person was there, and just a touch from you would give them hope. And then second, why sustainable public procurement? Because all of those issues are there, and I'm trying to say most probably sustainable public procurement can influence the government. I mean, a subtle way of promoting everything, fighting corruption, promoting social issues and everything, and environment. And then I know that international organizations have a role because I work for Asian Development Bank as legal and procurement specialist, where we reviewed documents of bidding documents that are funded by ADB in developing countries. So I really believe on the importance of international organization. But you see, you said, yes, you can perform your role better if we have a united Security Council, but the problem is we don't have. So given though we don't have a united organization up there, and there are people on the ground that are waiting for help from international organization, if you can summarize, at least give me at least one or two of the biggest role of international organization in promoting all of these aspects of sustainability from the ground, what would that role be? Thank you.
Thank you. I, of course, have a bias. I think the Security Council is a great failure, but in a way it's also checks and balances, you know. There are checks and balances because there's these two groups that are opposed. So one can't really use the Security Council to do only their will, which is also a good thing. But still, I think it is a failure and political issues are not resolved. For me, I think the great success of the UN has been its humanitarian wing, despite its, because it's understated and not human rights. Human rights is more controversial, but its humanitarian wing, which is the World Food Program. You can go to any country in the world, in Africa, And if you go to the most remotest part, I went to Central African Republic in the middle of absolutely just 1 or 2 villages in very thick jungles, because a lot of child soldiers were being recruited by the Rhodes Resistance Army. You will find the Catholic Church and you will find UNICEF. So I think UNICEF does an enormous amount of good work, and they do it quietly. And the UNHCR also, if you go to, I went and stayed at the Cox's Bazar refugee camp where the Myanmar refugees are for some time, and they have really unbelievably managed that situation in a way that I would have thought impossible when I went to it. Just as the Rohingyas crossed over, I crossed over to, we went to Cox's Bazar, and it was such chaos and people with such raw wounds and so much to tell, and one would never thought it could have been managed. But they have now managed it. I'm not saying it's a solution, but they have managed it. So to that extent, I think the humanitarian wing of the UN is better. Yeah. But that's where I would put my, if I had to choose, that's what I would choose. Any other question?
Thank you very much for sharing your insights, first-hand insights, I would say. My question is quite simple and very precise. So the way you talk about UN and its presence on ground, it seems like a kind of homogeneous understanding of the UN. So I would actually encourage you to reflect a bit more specifically with reference to the Rohingya crisis, where the UN country chief had a questionable involvement in the making of the problem itself, where, I mean, as the report suggests, she had to even hush up some of her own colleagues who came up with alerts that something big is going to happen. But there was a kind of priority for development and so on and so forth that came at the cost of human rights. So, and then of course UN went there on ground to find facts, and then I'm sure you and your colleagues are now working on the way forward. So if you could reflect on this sort of like internal conflict, prioritization of policies on ground, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
At every UN country team meeting, nationally or internationally, there's always 2 groups. One is the political and the UNDP on one side, which basically want to work with governments. And the other side, you have the human rights organization. Humanitarians are generally, depends on the issue, and they're quieter. And this happened also in the country team in Myanmar. A big division between the UNDP and the political wing, DPA, Department of Political Affairs, in the country team, and the humanitarians and the human rights organization. The head of the country team, she took completely the side of political and UNDP instead of mediating the difference, and also became a close friend of Aung San Suu Kyi, and therefore did not believe that she would do anything wrong or allow anything like that to happen, as happened to many people. Every week after our report, we get people say, she would never let this happen. I think many people didn't respond. I must say, even including myself, for the first week I was saying, I have met her, and in my youth, we have marched for her release. I worked in the Sri Lankan parliament to get a resolution for her release. So many things we did and then this happens. I think for a week there was just her personality had stopped people from responding. So because of that, there was a major breakdown, and the UN had come up with what is called a human rights upfront approach to its thing, which allows your head of your country team to raise human rights issues, and if they're made persona non grata, that won't count in your career. That was many of the reasons why people were not doing these things. They're worried about their career, or worried about this would look like. So now it's very clear that if you state in policy what human rights issues should be and raise it. But she failed all counts, and we have asked for an inquiry, into this, and that's in our report, as you know, 3 pages of that asking us, mentioning all the reasons why there should be an inquiry into how the country team conducted itself. So that will come out hopefully in a few months. Hopefully, I think it was going to be, they're going to set it up, I was told, in February.
Hi. My name is Grisada from Thailand. I work with the NGO about the natural resource management. In our feeling, UN is still very far from us. So when the local people from the south of Thailand who suffer from the power plant project, they cannot demonstrate at the White House because the government prohibit to do that. So we have to demonstrate at the UN office. Try to request to UN to listen me. So maybe I prefer that. Why the UN should have like a systematic consultation continually with the people. So, and now I know that a lot of UN projects work with the people, but we should have like a consultation continually. That what happened, something that break the SDG goal that UN prefer. So that in our country, but in the global level, do you know they have a lot of people movement, like Via Campesina about the world farmer movement, and many kind of movement that we should and World Social Forum too. So we should have maybe consultation in the international level to make some decision to following that how FDG can achieve, how the problem still going on in the every level. Maybe if we have a lot of level that people can access, can participate with the UN, so maybe we can use UN power to solve problem within my country also. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very first I must say that I should have said this in the beginning, do not have, as I said, the UN is a very complex organization. There are many parts of the UN that will deal with the environment, that will deal with farmers' issues that I'm not aware of. So there might be movements going on and consultations going on. But let me just say that this issue raises a fundamental question. I actually thought, for some reason, maybe because David was organizing this, that most of the critique would come from those who want the UN to be involved less. So that's why I prepared my remarks to show that actually, there's a space there. But if you want the UN to be involved more, countries actually, I find, if I think of my own, do to some extent, if proposals are brought to the UN, would involve them more. But linking up the UN and social movements directly, bypassing the nation state, that is more difficult. And it does happen now. I think the UN does open its channels to now social movements and to human rights movements. And sometimes that's not to the approval of the nation state, and they stop it, or they put pressure on the UN to stop it. But that equation, the UN bypassing the nation state and dealing directly with social movements, is something you have to think about. Is that something you want? And of course, nation states do not want that very clearly, because and they think that you foster all these feelings that they're then used against the nation state, etc. But I think some governments don't, because if their policies are aligned to the UN, governments' policies are aligned to the UN, then there is no hesitancy in letting the UN deal directly with social movements. If the government's policies are not aligned with the UN template or the UN suggestions in that area, and the UN has suggestions in every area, then governments do not like you dealing directly with social movements because they think that would cause instability. Where does one come out in that debate? I don't know, because sometimes even myself I react to this overwhelming presence of the UN in everything. I do feel that we have to think about that because, and I thought I'd come here to argue against David, but now I'm going to use his argument, which is that basically it is a maze of technocratic language and discussion and debate, the UN, that is first difficult to negotiate. Now, I'll give you an example. The UN took the move to work with UNICEF to have an anti-trafficking law in Nepal. And they used the UN template with the help of other countries, and they created this anti-trafficking law. And they got all the secretaries of the ministries to agree. And they also created a task force. Then, when I went there 2 years later, so I met the task force. This looked very impressive, all the secretaries of the ministry. I said, how many times have you met? Never. So in a sense, it's this constant technical, legal coaching and whatever, with very little knowledge of the ground situation. The other is this women, peace and security area. Now, forcing women's rights activists, not forcing, but at least to work with the state on issues of peace and security, I had to plead with them. I said, these women are the victims of the state. You can't expect them to talk to the state. This is this notion that everybody can talk together, when actually they are the victims of state action because they're human rights defenders. How can you have human rights defenders share their knowledge and working experience with the state? So this kind of a little naivete and technical kind of knowledge that the UN brings to a situation has to, so the local partners are very key because they're the ones who will bring that knowledge to the UN to say, look, this is too technical, this won't work, whatever. But if you adopt it lock, stock and barrel, you'll have what happened in Nepal. They just won't meet. They first don't understand the law, they don't know what it's in it, and they won't meet. So the UN as a technical haze is something that we have to deal with at the UN level and also at the local level.
Hi, my name is Nina. I'm doing my PhD at the University of Melbourne, Australia. I just wanted to ask because we are a group of policy leaders and scholars. I was wondering if, based on your extensive experience, what role do you see we play as scholars, as academics, as policy leaders? Is there a particular role that we should play or that we can do in order to promote human rights and the goals of the United Nations?
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to make a comment on the genre or style that you adopted to speak with us this morning. You explicitly decided to conduct most of your conversation with us in the mode of, basically telling us what you have recorded in your diary about what it's like to work in the field. It's a tremendously effective genre or form, narrative form, I think, for conveying, in particular, the complexities and the paradoxes of the aspirations to further humanitarian and human rights goals. So, for example, the small detail about what happened to you on as you went to the hospital reveals a shocking endurance of apartheid in post-apartheid South Africa. The discovery of the black head peeping up behind the very elaborate suite for the protection of rape victims somehow puts into sharp relief the fact that a focus on one area can coexist with shocking problems in another. It's such an effective genre that I wanted to ask you, do you plan to publish these sorts of reflections? And B, is there a way, do you think, to integrate this mode of discussion and communication into the work that you and other rapporteurs do, and perhaps even official communications? Because I think there are reasons that we sometimes are compelled, as you have done this morning, to adopt narrative and even other artistic forms. They permit us to convey complexities that the standard analytic report, especially one requiring consensus, doesn't permit. I'd love any reflections on that. Thank you.
Well, let me first answer yours. Yeah, as scholars in politics, scholars, of course, is the world of ideas. And, you know, that is very crucial world. It'll be bad ideas as well, but there's also, it's a crucial world, and the scholars lead you in creating those worlds of ideas. And you don't know who will take them and run with them sometimes. You know, Donald Trump running off with postmodernism is really a frightening phenomenon. But I think that putting forward new ideas on issues of human rights, especially on the areas, the debates that I mentioned that are there, human rights and the nation state and that equation. As policymakers, I think one thing you have to look at is the role of national government, local organizations, local grassroots organizations in this dialogue on human rights. Because now for this decade and the decade before, it's mainly been the international dialogue, where a lot of the national groups do the work, but for security reasons and others, they give the information perhaps to international groups who then raise the issues. So I think really developing the national framework for human rights, especially among grassroots organizations and others, is the way forward, in my opinion. And they can then negotiate as equals with international organizations who have a certain role to play as well, as a counter. With regard to you, I know I was a little nervous about doing this because I am writing these for a book. But what I feel, you know, Gayatri Spivak once said that before you have experience and then you have it all then classified by reason at some point. But then just the sheer expression of the experience in some ways brings out all those nuances that you're expressing to the council or to anybody else or in public analytical don't come out. You know, it's only when you're writing this that all those nuances come, like, you know, remembering the swagger of the American serviceman, or remember the shock of sitting there in this couch and this black head, and he waved at me, you know, so it was, and all that come when you're writing in this mode. They don't come when you're trying to put things into some rational, analytical framework. And the kind of realities that the UN faces on the ground are so complex that you can do a lot of harm. Like putting women human rights defenders, first even alerting the government that these are the women human rights defenders whom you want at the meeting, and immediately alert them who they are. You know, so, you know, there's all kinds of lack of understanding the nuances, especially in conflict areas and in countries. So I think that's what I was trying to bring out, the nuances of the UN operating in the field in situations of conflict, mainly. Thank you for that. Now I'm not so worried about.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for your insights and experience. If you can join me in giving Radhika a hand. We are over time, so they're going to quickly organize these rooms into new configurations. So we're being asked to take all our belongings and we be rewarded with coffee and seats outside.